I can do that. Okay.
Good evening. We'll wait just a minute or two for people to come in. Okay, I think we've got a good audience in here. I'm Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I want to say just a few words before we get to our last book talk of the semester. So let me start by just the standard overview of how the webinar will work, just in case there's anybody new. We've set it up as a webinar. So to ask questions, you should use the Q&A button, and you can put in a question at any point in the presentation, and then I will be moderating the questions at the end. I wanted to say a few words about upcoming events, although since it's the end of the semester, we don't have too many. On Friday at noon, we have our inaugural event for the Lady Blanca Rosenstiel Endowed Program in Polish Heritage with an eminent scientist from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So not sort of typical humanities things, but Polish heritage is a pretty widespread phenomenon. We have lots of great talks and so forth next semester. So as a teaser, I'll just give you the first of our Stanford Distinguished Professor lectures for next semester with Daphne Brooks from Yale University. But the focus tonight is on Stephen Butterman's latest lecture. And to introduce our speaker, I'll turn it over to our colleague, Hima Perez-Sanchez from Modern Languages.
Thank you, Hugh. It is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's author, my colleague and one of my dearest friends, Stephen Butterman, who is currently an associate professor of Portuguese, soon hopefully a full professor, and the director of the Portuguese language program in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at UM, where he also directed the Gender and Sexuality Studies program for many years and helped to launch the minor in LGBTQ studies. Steve received a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2000 and then promptly joined UM that very year. So because, you know, in this presentation, you have to roast the speaker a little bit, particularly if they're a really, really good friend like Steve. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how to this day, I remember distinctively the job talk that Stephen Butterman gave on the Brazilian poet Glauco Matoso and his poetic and perhaps literal practice of cropovagia, a word I will not translate today because we're online and being recorded for posterity, but which I encourage you to look up in a Portuguese dictionary. And I'm sure that, of course, many of the audience members here speak Portuguese perfectly and will know about it. So Glauco Matoso would become the subject of Steve's first excellent academic monograph, Perversions on Parade, Brazilian Literature of Transgression and Postmodern Anti-Aesthetics in Glauco Matoso, published by San Diego University Press in 2005. But that memorable day of spring 2000, during his on-campus talk, Steve gifted us with a masterclass on poetic close reading and the power of subversive literature to affect change, especially under dictatorial regimes, a topic that is also very close to my interest. The talk was so successful, and Steve endeared himself to the Modern Languages and Literatures faculty so instantly that some colleagues who had not been invited to the dinner with candidate Butterman crashed it anyway. As I recall, we were all animately talking politics, sexuality, poetry, and generally fixing the world's problems until very late that night. And Steve got the job, of course, and as they say, the rest is history, and we're lucky to have him as a colleague. That's it, Steve. I'm not roasting you anymore. It's just that was really funny to see how many colleagues just wanted to be invited to that dinner with Steve Butterman. Steve is a recipient of many grants and awards, too many to enumerate here, but they include a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute Award in 2002, and Summer Seminar also from the NEH in 2010. He's also the winner of the Brazilian International Press Award, University of Miami's Provost Excellent in Teaching Award, and the 2004 University of Miami Scholarly and Creative Activity Award. However, most recently, he's received one of our newest in-house awards, the prestigious Andrew W. Mellon Create Grant, to co-organize with our colleague Tracy Devine Guzman the International Virtual Symposium Documenting Diversity and Democracy in Brazil, which was tremendously successful. It invited speakers from Brazil and the United States, and it lasted for 2 days, and it was really an exciting event. Among all the many titles and awards he has received, however, I know that one of the ones of which he is the proudest is the Mulher Honorária, or Honorary Woman Award, conferred by REBRA. And I'm going to massacre all of the Portuguese pronunciation, so I apologize for that. Da Rede de Escritoras Brasileiras. He received that in recognition of the writing of a preface for a work and for the development of a collaboration between REBRA and Steve also serves in the editorial advisory board of Bagoas, a revista de estudos gays, gênero e sexualidades, which is a peer-reviewed journal published at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, and is a reviewer of manuscripts for several international academic presses. I'm just summarizing because really his accomplishments are enormous. In addition to the books I'm going to talk about now a little bit, he has published articles and a wide range of topics in the books themselves, focusing on transnational lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and plus studies, gender and feminist studies, and the cultural context of Portuguese-speaking countries. And most recently, really his passion is activism and the LGBTQ activism in Brazil in particular. So in addition to that first monograph that I mentioned on Glauco Matoso, Steve Butterman is the author of Invisibilidade Vigilante, Representações Midiáticas da Maior Parada Gay do Planeta, or Vigilant Invisibility, Journalistic Representations of the Largest Pride Parade on the Planet, which was published by Invessus in Sao Paulo in 2012. This is a book on activism that makes the very important and political intervention of moving beyond academia and serving a larger audience, something that we in academia are sometimes afraid of doing, but that it's in particular for the kinds of topics that Steve works on is crucial, so that we don't stay in our ivory tower and then there's a communication with the activists whose work we study as well. So his most recent academic monograph, which will be the one that he talks about today, Queering and Querying the Paradise of Paradox, LGBT Language, New Media and Visual Cultures in Modern Day Brazil, published by Rauman and Littlefield International in 2021, is an amazing book. And he will talk extensively about it, but I think that it's basically an impressive tour de force in the sheer magnitude of the breadth of its archive and its objectives, like his second book, to be both an academic work and an activist intervention, not to mention that it functions as a memorial to all the victims of homo, lesbo, and transphobia in Brazil. So and in the world. That's one of the greatest contributions of this book, and I think you will really, really enjoy it. But let me tell you a little bit more about Steve's many accolades. He is also a very accomplished and much beloved pedagogue. His graduate students and undergraduate students adore him. I know this for a fact. And he has them not only at UM, but at many other institutions, because while he works at UM, of course, he's also held visiting professorships or visiting scholar positions at schools such as Middlebury College, Tulane University, the University of Sao Paulo, and UniLaSalle in Canoas, Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And he was also appointed by the Institute of International Education as a 2021-2022 US Fulbright Scholar to Brazil. In fact, Steve is instrumental in helping bring to our university scholar teachers through the Fulbright program to teach in our Portuguese language program. So his relationship to the Fulbright is really, really intimate in this sense. Steve has delivered over 40 invited talks, not just conference paper, but invited talks, and has delivered keynote addresses at universities throughout the world, including Brazil, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And he has given dozens of academic conference presentations also throughout the world. So he's an incredibly active academic. But in addition to all of that, Steve is an accomplished translator of poetry and novels from Portuguese into English, of course. And this is, I think, very dear to his heart, and one of the traits of Steve that is, I think, most worth celebrating, which is that he serves regularly as an expert witness on asylum petition cases that involve homophobia, lesbophobia, and transphobia, and also domestic violence in Brazil and other countries. And I know that those are incredibly time-consuming and very close to Steve's heart as well. And again, I think that it demonstrates one of the most accomplished traits of Steve, which is that he bridges academia and activism. He acts in what basically his research is also his activism, but he also is an activist outside of the classroom and outside of the academic world. I think you will really enjoy Steve's talk today. I have enjoyed tremendously this book. It's an excellent work, and it's my pleasure to then pass on the word and the baton to my dearest friend, Steve Butterman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that lovely introduction. Very, very generous. I love you and I miss you. And I know it's not academic and professional to say those things, but it happens to be the truth. So thank you for that beautiful, warm introduction. Everything goes downhill from here because of, I'm the person that I want to be the person that Emma thinks that I am. But I thank everybody for being here this evening. I'm very, very honored to be presenting this work, especially on a day like today. As we know, December continues with the holiday season, but it also begins with World AIDS Day. And in July of this year, we were reminded that it's been 40 years since the first cases of AIDS were reported in the New York Times. And since it emerged in the early 1980s, HIV/AIDS, the pandemic has taken more than 40 million lives globally. And there has been significant efforts, as we know, to pathologize, to stigmatize, and to shame and lock up, incarcerate people living with HIV. And these HIV crackdowns have disproportionately harmed Black, Brown, LGBT, and sex worker communities and intersections thereof. So I would like, and today there's an estimate of approximately 38 million people who are living with HIV. So when we talk about the current pandemic of the coronavirus pandemic and HIV, we certainly have not conquered either, and we need to keep that in mind. A couple of other dedications before I move into my presentation. As Hema noted, I dedicate the book to the memory of the lives and the loves of the thousands of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and travesti Brazilian citizens who have been brutally murdered, both in spirit and in body. Though, hence this contribution is not merely my own, for it is informed by and stands in solidarity with our queer family in proud tribute to their lives, which meant so much more than their atrocious deaths. I humbly offer the pages of this book to the 3,147 Brazilian citizens killed for being LGBT and or T in the period of 1 decade, approximately the time it took for me to research, write, and publish this book. These numbers do not include those citizens whose internalized homo, lesbo, transphobia resulted in their choice to die. This book is also for the countless others who are thriving or merely surviving and whose invisibility, in itself tragic, may be the reason they are still alive today. I dedicate this book further to the readers it will likely never have, to the perpetrators of these atrocious crimes that have transfigured human lives into mortality statistics, for it is they who suffer from the most insidious disease of all, one that is diminished, negated, or minimized, one that is called by many different names, but which I posit here again for full visibility: homo, lesbo, transphobia. Finally, this book is for the vast majority who continue to be denied the justice they deserve, the right to be punished for hateful crimes against would-be versions of themselves they so bitterly and brutally repress. And finally, last but not least, I dedicate this book to my beloved father, Dr. Norman Butterman, in memoriam, and all other victims of the coronavirus and all the families who grieve the loss of their loved ones from afar. So many of us now know the acute anguish of loss compounded by the suffering of not being able to say goodbye. And I dedicate this book to my mom, Marilyn Silver Butterman, who sadly passed away 1 month ago, who lived valiantly and vibrantly with dementia. My mother occupied a magical parallel universe. Thank you, Mom, for nurturing within me the love of language and the gift of creativity. So what do I do in this book? The objectives, the main objectives of the study are sevenfold. I study characteristics that make life unique for sexual minorities in Brazil, while also viewing Brazil in relation to global LGBT sociopolitical movements. I critically assess the complex relationships between the visual arts and political activism, carefully analyzing artistic, cinematic, and photographic representations of LGBTQ+ identities. I argue for the usefulness and the challenges of Brazil as a case study for understanding the cultivation of ambiguity in contemporary constructions and reconstructions of queer life. I conduct the first comprehensive discourse analysis of the dynamics and features of the largest LGBT Pride Parade in the world from its inception in 1997 to the present time. I attempt to create a theoretical scholarly framework promoting linkages between political activism and academic scholarship. I problematize and analyze the relationship between burgeoning critical sociopolitical movements and institutions and the language and new media discourses that are used to configure and conceptualize them. And I examine, using discourse analysis, the intricacies of terminology Brazilian sexual minorities adopt and adapt, illustrating the development of LGBTQ identities through performative language use. My introduction, Pondering the Paradox LGBT Culture in Brazil Today, assesses both the existence and the irreconcilability of the internal contradictions which seem to typify Brazil and simultaneously characterize its queer positionality as an entity fascinated with the messiness of the creative process. And here I would like to make a quick shout out to Dr. Alison Schifani's excellent presentation a few weeks ago, in which messiness has sort of become the operative word of destabilizing otherwise ordered and progressive, in the sense of progress, minded preoccupations. I studied the cultivation of ambiguity. I explore how an interdisciplinary project such as this one may productively and simultaneously utilize tools from the social sciences while maintaining a cultural studies methodological framework to theorize the imaginary of Brazil as an ideally and perhaps even idyllically queer space. As such, I view Brazil's historical development and its present reality as inherently and quite purposefully ambiguous in nature, while attempting to avoid exoticizing difference. The theoretical foundations of my work consider Brasilidade as a concept that is permanently in flux, resisting attempts to placate a national character or define a profile of the country or its collective core values. Through an eclectic process of becoming and by occupying a space in between, alluding to Silviano Santiago's well-known analysis of Latin American cultures, it is a productive queer failure to queer the Brazilian imaginary, since I argue the cultural landscape of this space is quintessentially queer and hence has resisted until very recently the label, or rather non-label, of the word queer. I examine how an Anglo-American queer studies methodology may enter into productive dialogue with Brazilian conceptual maps of LGBT plus cultures. For example, São Paulo boasts, this is an example of one of the many, many paradoxes that I won't have time to talk about today, but São Paulo, and various sources confirm, boasts that it is the megalopolis which hosts the largest pride parade in the world, as we've heard with Hema's introduction. At the same time, we are witnessing the sobering reality of a nation identified in various media sources, internally and internationally, as the current world leader in homophobic hate crimes resulting in murder. How does ambiguity coexist with the positivistic formation of the Brazilian Republic, where order and progress, ordem, progresso, would seem to negate the very fabric of creative energy that otherwise leads to a continual self-reflexive process where chaos is a welcome ingredient to help sustain irresolvable contradiction? This book is not about COVID, and this book is about COVID. The pandemic haunts and ravages every single page. Covidiano agora é cotidiano. The Covidian is quotidian. What began as a book project to represent LGBTQ culture in Brazil in the first 2 decades of the new millennium literally found itself in flux after Bolsonaro's ascension to the presidency on January 1st, 2019. The pun in the former title of this manuscript, Brazilian Portuguese, LGBT language and culture in Brazil, is no longer funny, nor was it ever meant to evoke laughter. But though I coined the expression to encompass an interdisciplinary marking, or rather remaking or remarking of a conventional heteropatriarchal romance language like Brazilian Portuguese, much like the sociolex of Polari or gay speak in the United Kingdom or the US, I believe that the use of the term is no longer sustainable or responsible given the current administration in Brazil, or very recently in the US at the time that I was writing this manuscript. In the US, for example, New York's prominent Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art dropped its gay and lesbian identities, at least from its name. Disturbingly, no argument was made to replace this with queer, LGBT, LGBTQI+, or any other variation thereof. The terms gay and lesbian were simply erased. To be fair, the title adopted a new tagline reading, "The future is queer," with the hope that, and the executive director's intention, that everyone feel welcome to go to the museum. However, I ask myself, and I ask all of you, what are the costs involved in not naming the sexual minorities for whom this museum was intended and on whom it was based? What are the social and political consequences of referring to a queer future as if to acknowledge that the present time is not queer, and the marker of queerness would occur only in a future yet to come, or perhaps forever utopian? In an era when political agendas and activisms have converged with and through the Black Lives Matter movement, the familiar counter-argument that all lives matter rings painfully present, perpetuating a similar erasure and consequent inequality as the condescending, at best, or racist discourse of all are welcome or all are equal under the law ignores a global socio-political climate where neither is the case or the current reality. So I'm going to move quickly now through the chapters of the book to show some of the illustrations. For the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to analyze them. You'll have to read the book for that, which is also available as an ebook, by the way, and much less expensive. Unfortunately, I won't be able to describe the art, but I want to show the artwork that appeared last year in 2020 in the Museu da Diversidade Sexual in Brazil's Museum of Sexual Diversity, in an exhibit called Quarentena. And this is one of the first times in which queer has been sort of co-opted or at least considered in a Brazilian context. Most of these works speak for themselves. Certainly this one does. This is Prisão Domiciliar. And I'm just going to pause for a second. Also, a pause for you to view the art since I don't have time to talk about it. I do want to say that I will make the slide presentation of the entire manuscript available to anyone who requests it. Please just let me know or let Dr. Thomas know and we'll make it available. Another work that clearly speaks for itself when we move from one pandemic to another pandemic. And then we have the cover of the actual book, in which this final piece represents a contribution by the House of X, which was a collective founded in 2016 in Maringá, Paraná, in southern Brazil. And it consists of a drag family and community of trans-identified artists that includes drag queens, drag kings, drag queers, and tranimals, transcending the limitations of our own vital and viral humanity and not simply the gender binary. The work emphasizes unity and difference and togetherness despite separation in a project to create artistic representations of the members of the chosen family that unifies individuals into a community of belonging. The expression of that community is virtual, as if the images crafted to represent the members existed, participating on a Zoom call. The uneven blank squares of whiteness may serve to remind the viewer that there are community members who no longer occupy those spaces through absence or through death. On the other hand, the empty spaces could very well reflect that there is always room for the family to grow and for others to join in the call to be themselves together. So this image presented in the Quarentena, like the previous four, presents the result of piracies, of intentional piracies of the members of this collective. The idea is, as the mission statement itself says, to use the words of the collective, to map out these experimental trials using the practicality of cross-referencing. Who is who? Who is performing whom? We organize the artwork in such a way that we horizontally showcase all the works of each artist. Vertically, however, we are displaying the hacks of each individual artist. Since not every artist performs one another or even themselves, gaps or omissions obligatorily occur. These aesthetics dialogue with the concept of friendship in which one becomes the other of the same. Again, this is the exact quote from the mission statement in my translation. I'm going to say this again. These aesthetics dialogue with the concept of friendship in which one becomes the other of the same because it is through friendship that we share the processes of subjectivity passing through ourselves and one another. The organizational apparatus of the images also bears the intention to reflect the structure of individual confinement, each drag queen within her own line and or column, interacting with order, disorder of isolation, lockdown, but inevitably shattered by the chaos, the uncertainty, the blank spaces that the pandemic has created. Moving on to chapter 1, A Decade of Decadence, in which I perform a discourse analysis to examine whether slogans of the largest gay pride parade on the planet in its first 10 years or so are of a repetitive, cyclical, rhetorical, or chronological nature, and how this pattern may reflect the views of the Parade Commission itself in accordance with or in opposition to the actual participants in the parade, the majority of whom do not identify as queer or LGBT themselves. That's another interesting paradox for us to consider, which I do in the book. Chapter 2 continues to perform discourse analysis of the Pride Parade unique to São Paulo, furnishing the researcher with interesting universal insights, such as contemplating whether such events are truly political mega manifestations as they purport themselves to be, or instead simply a feverish festa, which serves a secondary purpose to function as a single city event that brings in the highest number of dollars every year. São Paulo Fashion Week is in a distant second place. I examined the repercussions of the tension between the philosophical and ethical goals of the event, oscillating between celebration, including depoliticization, and social protest, which prompted the association in 2008 to mandate the removal of the floats sponsored by and advertising bars and nightclubs. I don't have time to talk about this campaign that actually Hema knows very, very well, and we discussed extensively together. But the campaign is called, in English translation, Not Even a Saint Protects You, Wear a Condom. This is from the 2011 edition of the Pride Parade in São Paulo. Of course, very irreverent and very effective. These are pictures from the Pride Parade that year. And in the third chapter, I'm moving very quickly, chapter 3 brings us up to the date and brings us up to date and into the digital age. While 2012 was a banner year for attracting the largest attendance in the history of Pride Parades throughout the world, chapter 3 focuses special attention on more recent versions of the event, taking into account the past 3 years, 2018 to 2020, when the Primeira Parada Virtual do Orgulho LGBT de São Paulo aired on June 14, 2020, and the COVID-delayed live event was twice scheduled and twice canceled due to the ongoing pandemic. This is a campaign in chapter 3. You've noticed the title. I talk about fake news and what's zapping, which is, as many of you may know, the social media form that is predominant among Brazilians and has also been used to perpetuate fake news and misinformation and false truths to the general public. So here we have a poster indicating substituting the Q of queer with the P, pedosexual. That is an example of the manipulation that has taken place in the current administration. Chapter 4 takes up 3 relatively recent and controversial publications in Brazil and their public reception, all passing as reference books or even as instruction manuals. These texts have inscribed themselves as informational manuals that pertain to sexuality and to theorizing about sex in a Brazilian context. In this chapter, I provide a detailed examination of these publications and their public reception, inscribing themselves as informational manuals, in which the primary texts I choose are relatively recent, certainly within the last decade or two. And I theorize about these texts that superficially appear to speak for queer communities, yet upon closer examination reveal a hegemonic view of homosexuality inscribed with racist, classist, and even misogynist undertones, reinforcing heteronormative roles instead of inscribing them with new potentialities. Through this chapter, what informs a lot of this chapter is the ethnographic aspect in which I conducted interviews with the authors, as well as a wide spectrum of individuals representing varied socioeconomic classes, races, and genders to enhance understanding of how the terminology in these texts reflects or distorts the lexicon of words and phrases that are actually utilized in authentic social circles. Chapter 5 shares the ethical concerns and imperatives raised in Viviane Namaste's work on sex change, social change. But I am also interested in breaking through the stereotype that would hold sex work as the only viable form of gainful employment for Brazilian travestis, One of the most salient criticisms Namaste launches in her book is the need to acknowledge and to integrate the daily lives of transsexual or transgendered prostitutes into our theoretical considerations and challenges in political activism. This is the 5-cent tour through the book. That's moving so quickly. Chapter 6 studies organizations, NGOs like SOS Dignity, which strive to humanize or bring integrity to individuals through photography, treading a fine line between exploitation and objectification and the purported goal of humanization. The simultaneous creative arts outreach and legal work of an organization like SOS Dignity brings us squarely into the center of the tension between objectification or exploitation through the camera versus normalization by de-eroticizing sex workers with the attempt to restore their humanity or dignity as individuals. But do these photos project sensual poses or familiar faces? Ultimately, the chapter grapples with ethical issues around representation, including informed consent, contending with the paradox of how a photograph has both the power to reproduce exploitation and promote awareness that could lead to social change. My research shows that SOS Dignity represents the troubled relationship between art and politics as much as it zeroes in on the necessary link between academic scholarly work and sociopolitical activism. We must therefore take particular care in assessing the lives and the experiences of a population that is especially vulnerable to commodification and imperialism. The eroticized Brazilian body is a traveling exhibit, masquerading its carnival carnality abroad. This myth is one of the most dangerous stereotypes of all, that these sexualized and sexually adept, multi-gendered exotic Latins are to be used as objects of satisfaction. In this particular part of the Barry Michael Wolf's collection called Retratos de Casamento Trans, I find an extremely humanizing aspect in a different stage of the photographic process in which there's a marriage being represented and the accepting and embracing parents together with the newlyweds. Chapter 7, Forgetting Far Away from Home, Cinematic Representations of 21st Century LGBT Trans Brazil, examines feature-length films produced in Brazil from 2001 to the present, actually, theorizing queer diasporic studies to focus on cultural representations of Brazilians moving through geographical, existential, and identitarian displacement, emphasizing the motif of fleeing home in order to reinscribe and reconstruct what I call quome. This chapter is inspired and nourished by Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza Consciousness from 1986, one of the most influential books of my life, charting a journey that has as its objective a progressive transition to queer homes of their own invention. As such, I analyze the creation of queer utopias, alternative families and communities, and the depathologization and normalization of transgender, travesti, and transsexual character development, diverting the attention of the spectator to other societal taboos or quote unquote problems that result from patriarchal impositions. Specifically, I critically assess the creation of the utopia do cu in the film Tatuagem, the utopia of the asshole, literally. Contrasting cinematic creations of fictitious lands with the spectacularization in the fantasy worlds of Madame Satã, turning to the construction of a performative identity and queer flux as a response to and a protest of discrimination based on racism, homo-transphobia, contrasting more concrete grounded displacement in Dois Perdidos numa Noite Suja, and Princesa effectively queering the utopian American European dream of transbrasilidade abroad. Finally, in chapter 8, what's queer got to do with it? Queer normativity and heterobrasilidade in Brazil's queer museo. brings us almost to the present with the August 2018 re-inauguration of the Queer Museu, Cartografias da Diferença na Arte Brasileira in Rio de Janeiro, after two highly controversial and successful attempts at censorship, brought to the forefront a multiplicity of intersectional issues that echo, dramatize, and metaphorize, or I wanted to say metastasize, because I see it in those terms, unfortunately, Brazil's sociopolitical divisions. The victory, and as exhibit curator Gaudêncio Fidelis called it on numerous occasions, quote unquote, villainy of fascist state involvement, religious fundamentalism, and pernicious support for censorship of cultural initiatives designed to destigmatize creative production by and or about Brazilian gender sexual minorities. This intervention questions the paradoxically productive and destructive role of stigma when subscribing to queer theory's insistence on anti-normativity. The brief but volatile history of the museum's opening, its subsequent censorship in Porto Alegre, the use of social media to rehabilitate and resituate itself in Rio with the largest crowdfunding campaign in Brazil's history, reveals larger debates on freedom of speech, citizenship as activism, art as a site of cultural resistance, and the limits of reception and spectatorship on the basis of sexuality, gender, race, and even age. For example, a judge ordered on the eve of its opening that children 14 and under not be permitted to visit the exhibit. While the order was suspended days later by another judge, these reactions and actions stage current debates in Brazil on ideology of gender arguments, quote unquote, ideology of gender arguments, that continue to suppress gender studies and LGBT queer studies at all levels of the curriculum, from the kit de anti-homophobia at the secondary level to the repression and commission of aggression against Judith Butler's physical and scholarly body of knowledge. Chapter 8 continues to problematize simultaneously conflictual and consensual relationships between aesthetics, in this case, museum artwork, the ethical imperative of the museum as a cultural institution invested in creating space for and representing cultural artifacts of marginalized citizens, the rules of censorship, and the roles of freedom of speech in a quote unquote democracy, increasingly positioning itself in an ambivalent queer space and time, as Halberstam would say, consistently questioning the fragile foundations upon which it is employed and revoked in today's Brazil. See, I just have a few minutes left, so I want to discuss very quickly some of the exhibits. This first one that you see was the one I noticed upon entering the exhibit, prompting the spectator to look up almost to the ceiling to see it, and if heeded, to exercise caution upon proceeding. The giant poster on a black background with 3 different font sizes and colors imitates and parodies the warnings mandated to be placed on cigarette cartons about the long-term dangers of smoking and tobacco use. Quote, the Ministry of Health warns, Brazil kills more faggots than any other country in the world, unquote. The font size of the content of this warning is enormous, highlighting the magnitude and definitive nature of the problem, comparing the reality and severity of the violent consequences of the addictive habit, that is, certain and brutal death that may not come about swiftly, but as the inevitable consequence of the world's most violently homotransphobic society, one where machismo is a high-risk vice that causes others to die. The difference, of course, is that this illness is socially constructed rather than chemically formed, and that it does not target the individual who is addicted to the practice, but rather the object onto which the consequent hatred is placed or misplaced. Written in all capital letters and appearing in a hot pink color, one that universally represents the international LGBT movement, the stern warning, while mimicking governmental intervention in labels and packaging of consumer products, makes no claim that the perpetrator of such crimes will suffer punishment or responsibility, even for murder, as the warning is conceived as an inevitable, even chemical outcome of a homophobic society. As a spectator viewing an intervening warning before setting foot in the queer journey that is the exposition, it is imperative to ask who is being advised. There is no distinction made here of perpetrator or victim, suggesting that these crimes are conditioned by a society that perpetuates their commission with impunity. The colloquial use of bisha, a pejorative but reclaimed slang term, which I examine thoroughly throughout the book, paralleling to a large extent the use of the term queer, that was once pejorative and is now reclaimed in a positive sense, is made even more informal by using the homophonic and homophobic X, she's, in the place of the CH, as if to say X marks the spot. As a spectator is greeted at ground zero of queer expression and creativity, motivated by an egregious social situation that reveals the enormity of Brazil's lethal homophobic legacy and positionality in the present. The use of the present tense warns, adverte, indicates that the crime is both present and unavoidable. Despite its naturalization and lack of punishment for its commission, I read the use of capital letters here as an exclamation, which in the age of social media jargon has come to symbolize, as we know, a shout, a denunciation against this injustice. The third and final phrase, written in the smallest of the three fonts and in yellow, that for Brazilian spectatorship represents the national flag, also signals the eyes to move slowly, pausing, so that the words do not go unnoticed or unprocessed. A literal translation of the phrase reads as follows. Quote, vulnerability, physical, artistic, mental, in transit, affect or affective, economic, educational, workplace, familial, spiritual, political, structural, institutional life in Rio de Janeiro. The inverted syntactic structure of the phrase, while difficult to capture in English translation, requires the reader, spectator to reconstitute the meaning of the words and their grammatical usage. Put another way, each of the adjectives employed to describe vulnerability transcend not only any attempt to define or placate the nature of that vulnerability, but also the parts of speech, or better, use of language to denote it. For example, in Portuguese, the use of the term institucional can allude to both institutional and institutionalized. Vulnerability is present in structural factors that include education, even manners or etiquette, modes of behavior considered appropriate in the context of the Romance languages, as well as the educational system at large. The multivalent noun empregancia denotes the workplace, but simultaneously refers to labor rights and conditions. In sum, while the warning gives us indicators of possible side effects, much like we would read on a medicine bottle or a prescription label, the list that ensues encompasses every conceivable area of human life, running the gamut from lack of acceptance or rejection from the family unit to discrimination at the place of employment, to compromising mental and emotional health, to lack of access to educational opportunities, even denying the right to develop a personal spirituality. After noting the warning and entering the Queer Museo at my own risk, I felt at ease, at queer home, when I noticed the presence of two trans people of color working as docents in the museum, providing clues to help spectators interpret artworks while fielding questions from audience members, a refreshing sign of the exhibit's inclusivity. To better understand what is at stake is one of the most explicit cases of censorship of a cultural artifact since Brazil's military dictatorship, I would like to take a very brief step back to highlight a chronological accounting of the key historical events that shaped the trajectory. I don't have time for the whole novella, so to speak. You'll have to, again, read the book for that. Instead, I would rather use the last few minutes of my presentation to share with you a few of the works from this exhibit. This first piece here is by celebrated Carioca artist Adriana Varejão, who was commissioned to produce a seascape mural to encircle the new aquatic center built for the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro. To use the artist's characterization of her own work in an interview with the New York Times, she writes or says that it is a fragmented, reordered, and turbulent work. This piece is called Cena de Interior 2, a socio-political denunciation of slavery, racism, sexual exploitation, and violence perpetuated against people of color, accused by the Movimento do Brasil Livre of promoting zoofilia and implying that such work could influence the impressionable to commit acts of bestiality, Varejão resurrects an ancient Japanese art reminiscent of the shunga prints, a type of erotic art in the traditional style of ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, referring to a genre of Japanese woodblock print and painting from the Edo period, 1603 to 1867, in order to critique structural, physical, and sexual violence throughout history and regardless of the location or site in the world. It is worth noting, in a parallel situation to censorship of the Queer Museo exhibit, that these artworks, literally translated to English as spring pictures, were banned in Japan for the majority of the 20th century. In the New York Times article I alluded to, Laura von Straten writes that much of Varejão's work, quote, asks uncomfortable questions about the hidden bloody stories of racism and subjugation, Portugal's colonization of Brazil in particular, but also England's and Spain's of other parts of the Americas, unquote. The piece shown at Queer Museo certainly reinforces this characterization. At first glance, the spectator is prompted to trace this work to another piece that does not exist, an original work perhaps from Japan. Skipping toward the end, the implication of a second set of work of the Deutsch, or perhaps metaphorically a reoccurrence of historical processes, of colonial legacies that this piece playfully and repulsively displays. Appearances are deceptive in much of Varejão's artistic universe. The object appears to have been produced on rice paper, reminding us of an ancient Japanese scroll kept for centuries, with stains and both horizontal and vertical lines indicating that this document has been preserved for years, folded and wrinkled to connote the old age of the piece, perhaps acquired by an art collector. However, contemporary viewers will recognize that sadly, this is a tragic story or history told over and over again, depicting historical processes that repeat themselves despite time and place. There are 9 characters portrayed, men and women of different racial and ethnic backgrounds involved in sexual relations with one another. In one case, we witnessed 2 white men with an animal. The bottom right corner of the artwork features 3 men, 2 white and 1 black man, who is sexually serving the other 2, both orally and anally, reminding the viewer that even same-sex relations cannot escape from racist colonial legacies where the animalized bodies of slaves were objects to be used for both economic gain and for sexual pleasure. Varejão thus denounces patriarchal exploitation and rape culture in the same brush. Neither the black slaves nor the unidentified animal has a choice about participating in these relations, which are displayed with no judgment except that which the viewer confers upon them. It is, of course, no coincidence that the white men in the bottom corner are the only 2 wearing modern clothes, marking both their racial and gendered privilege, while simultaneously reminding the spectator that this painting is as historical in nature as it is contemporary. This confers a somewhat ahistorical timelessness that may speak more to the universal violence in human nature than to specific cultural contexts. There's also the depiction of an interracial couple, a white woman with a black man, which of course would not have been tolerated in a racist colonial framework. In this complex piece, to conclude, there are different horizontal levels with separate scenes. However, when the viewer mentally flips the painting, all the sexual scenarios are vertically connected with a pillar on the left side transforming into stair steps. All of the people portrayed are practicing sexual relations in different constellations with the singular similarity that all are having sex. The portrayal of the 2 women in the top of the drawing appears different than the rest, and only in part because it is upside down. The spectator voyeur perceives a more intimate exchange of sexual relations, where there's a sense of agency, implying freedom and playfulness in the sexual connection between the 2. Of course, tolerance or acceptance of erotic love between lesbian women and not just sex with the attention and the attainment of pleasure of the male viewer would turn heteropatriarchal societies on their head. And with that, I'm going to just go very quickly through the rest of the artwork without any commentary, just to get a sense. Much of the work speaks for itself, does not need my detailed analysis, but I hope you will consider your own impressions of these pieces. These are protests outside involving the censorship of the exhibit in the Santander Bank, the Cultural Center in Porto Alegre. And this is a final slide that is a picture of one of the docents that I described earlier. I don't have time to talk about this amazing piece in which the artist used his own blood to create the swords of St. George of Cappadocia by African slaves to Brazil, a plant of African origin where it has flourished, but it bears significant spiritual significance in Candomblé. You can read a little bit about the rest. And again, the conclusions will have to wait for your questions, for your Q&A. And I would like to end by thanking very much Dr. Gemma Perez Sanchez, Associate Professor of Spanish and also Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Miami, for a beautiful and heartwarming introduction that I don't deserve, no mereço, but I appreciate so much. I would like to thank the fabulous staff at the Center for the Humanities, Dr. Hugh Thomas, Oni Dunham, and Dr. Christina Larson, who I've had the pleasure to work with in other wonderful contexts, and also Professora Lidiana de Moraes dos Santos, one of our graduate students, a PhD candidate in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, for her tremendous moral and labor support in putting together the pedagogical aspects and the slides, working through the slides with me on this presentation. E obrigado a todos presentes. I have here more information that you can also learn more and get involved by reading a fairly recent statement from the US Network for Democracy on defending LGBTI plus rights in Brazil. The link is part of the slide presentation, which I'll be happy to leave in your hands. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions, comments in Portuguese and English, como vocês quiserem, as you would like.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really impressed by how wide-ranging this book is. Academics are often accused of narrowness, and I don't think we can accuse you of that. And also getting through it in pretty short order. I think we'll probably try to go till 9:10. I already see some questions coming up, although some of these are also well-deserved congratulations. I'll start with a question from Octavio Bueno. Says, Steve, what an impressive, inspiring, and much needed book. Thank you so much for writing it. When you consider materials and institutions as diverse as sex manuals, photographs, motion pictures, and museums, is there a central underlying issue that brings together the scholar and the activist in you? If so, what is it, and what do you do with the issue? What should your readers do with it?
Excellent question, Otávio. Muito obrigado pela pergunta. So as a cultural studies scholar, I try to look at various cultural artifacts that don't necessarily dialogue with each other, but they're also not written and produced in a vacuum, as a way to enrich, to deepen our levels of understanding, including of the contradictions and paradoxes that I study, and to get to squeeze as much information and context out of a cultural landscape like Brazil, for example, a cultural imaginary, the imaginary of Brazil. And in order to do that, I think it is necessary to, although it has been very difficult, and that's why it's taken me almost 10 years to do this project, to actually get those sources to dialogue with one another and still maintain a thread that goes through the book. And the thread that I see moving through the book is the emphasis on the prefix trans, because this kind of movement between various cultural artifacts and genres is precisely the way that we can appreciate an interdisciplinary work that not only bridges the humanities and social sciences, or tries to, in this case, but also uses the tools sort of eclectically of both to be able to discern as much meaning and value from our journeys that engage with these various genres. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but I'm happy to provide clarifications necessary.
So yeah, if Ottavio wants to follow up, I'll let him write it in the Q&A. I'll turn now to Alison Schifani, who says, thanks so much for this truly wonderful presentation, Steve. I hope you'll forgive a selfish question. Can you talk a bit more about the way you frame media specificity and or, sorry, this just skipped, and or media aesthetics in your work?
Yes, thank you, Alison. That's actually a great question. So, and this is also one of the issues that that I grappled with in putting the manuscript together, is sort of how to looking at new media, looking at visual cultures, because the book is very disparate in that sense. For example, chapter 3, the one that is about what's zapping, the Pride Parade in Brazil, is much more deeply focused on social media platforms like Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, and various others, in ways in which truths or representations of truths, which are actually falsehoods or misrepresentations or manipulations, are used to generate even more homo, lesbo, transphobia in a Brazilian context. So the ways in which I use media are manifold, and that's why I really appreciate your question, Alison. I also use media in a more traditional sense, not just in new media social platforms, but in a traditional sense of photography, of museology, artworks, illustrations, so that media would take on a more sort of traditional approach, and not necessarily with the technology involved in social platforms or social media that we understand it today. So, but that was always, I mean, you hit a sort of on the nerve of something that I struggled with through the book, and that is balancing the traditional conceptualizations of media, what that would look like, with new technologies or relatively new technologies in which visual cultures are represented. So really, for me, the operative word would be visual cultures, and how media sources. Also, a third level of meaning is that I look extensively, as I mentioned, at journals, newspapers in particular, jornais, sorry, that's a literal translation, mainstream newspapers specifically in Brazil, to see how popular mainstream, not LGBT oriented, but mainstream media sources such as the Folha de São Paulo, the Estado de São Paulo, etc., represent the Pride Parade. So really, your question is a very rich one, and there are many answers to it. The media is a multivariate term for the purposes of this work.
Thanks. So we'll turn next to Tracy Devine Guzman, who asked a question that I was wondering about, although she frames it much more coherently than I would have. But she starts with saying, big love to you, Steve. Could you please talk about how the Brazilian LGBT plus community has collaborated alongside with other marginalized or targeted populations, peoples, social movements towards empowerment or even for survival, either historically or in these most recent dark times? How does cultural production fit into these strategies, if at all?
Thank you, Tracy. That's a great question, which also hits at the center of the intersectionalities that I try to bring together throughout the course of the book. There are those intersectionalities include indigeneity, indigenous populations, as well as Afro-Brazilian production, cultural production. There is still a tendency, no matter how far we've come since Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality discussions and more recent kind of rehabilitations and resuscitations and reconfigurations of intersectionality, there is still a tendency, and I see this tendency with particular resonance in Brazilian culture, in my view, in which it is still difficult to separate, it is still common, I should say, to separate out by not including the diversity of identities. So what has helped change that consciousness in recent times in Brazil, and I won't go into too much depth on this, time and also for emotional well-being, is the assassination of Marilyn and Felina, who, as we know, it was a politician, Afro-Brazilian politician who came from the favelas in Rio de Janeiro and self-identified as bisexual, also a mother, so that her own multiplicities of identities encompassed a wider range, and I think also brought, her death was a horrible, terrible moment in recent Brazilian history. The only silver lining that I could see is that it brought a deeper understanding of the intersectionality of identities. In terms of indigeneity, Brazil has a long ways to go. I think Tracy Devine Guzman's work is instrumental in moving us into indigeneity in Brazilian and other South American, Andean in particular contexts, which I certainly appreciate. More recent studies have tried to, but they're just coming out, literally, of looking at LGBT indigeneity. And so far, as often happens in the social sciences, and this is not my critique of social science, but ethnographies seem to be like among the first, and and I'm thinking about Fernando Esteves, if I'm not mistaken, initial articles about queer indigeneity, but it's really new. It should not be, but the idea of making intersectionality into a practice of actually in praxis, not just in theory, has come, I think, fairly late to Brazil. But it's there. I see that's the one piece of hope that I find in these, as you said, Tracy, in these very dark times, is that we're finally getting to a place, and we saw this with the Documenting Diversity and Democracy conference that Hema spoke so beautifully about in the introduction, that we are looking at intersectionality now in practice in addition to theory. And I think we're just really starting. When it comes to trans identities, and particularly male to female, Afro-Brazilian, travesti identities, I think there's still a tremendous amount of commodification and exoticization, and including of sex work performed by travestis that tends to exploit, frankly, and romanticize the most vulnerable and the most hated and murdered segment of Brazilian population. And it's only very recently in the last few years that travesti, the term travesti, is not necessarily associated with sex work. And I think if you ask a lot of Brazilians even today, certainly it's been my experience in my own research, how that the equation of travesti with sex worker or prostitute is instantaneous, but that's no longer the case. There are, well, it can be, and sure, it is often, but there are travesti workers that are politicians now that don't identify as transgender or trans, that identify as travesti, that maintain their biological, quote unquote, male biological organs, and yet present themselves as women, identify themselves as in the female, and yet do not consider themselves trans, consider themselves travestis. So some of those intersectionalities that you brought up in your question are also very important for us to extricate and to appreciate first, and then extricate within trans identities, within transgénero, transformista, cross-dressing, travesti, transsexual, and I try to do a lot of that, as much of that as I can, in 2 chapters of the book, in chapters 4 and I think it's 5 and 6 actually. Thank you for that excellent question. I hope I started to answer it.
So I think we'll go with 2 more questions, even though there's more in here. And I'll go to the next question from George Udisi, who says, Great presentation, can't wait to read the book. I wonder how queer people within religious communities, I'm thinking particularly of evangelicals, are placed in Brazil. I would think that they may be closeted in their evangelical communities, I don't know. And on the other hand, I wonder how they are seen by more activist queer networks. Any leads on this? He also adds, I ask this given there are so many evangelicals in Brazil and knowing that not all evangelicals think alike.
One of the reasons I am so proud to be a part of my department, Modern Languages and Literatures, is that my colleagues ask excellent, well thought out questions. And this is another one. Thank you, Emil Chapa. Thank you, George, for that excellent question. What I'm thinking about is the research that I did during the at and about the Pride parades in São Paulo. And these, what I would like to call apparent contradictions in which there were self-defined evangelical Brazilians who were also coming to the parade and coming out as gay and or lesbian or bisexual. You see this kind of intersectionality, to go back to that term, throughout, especially in the second phase of what I call the second phase in 2010, 11, 12, 13, in which you also see, not to change the subject, but just as another sort of comparison, skinheads who came to the Pride Parade. The military police tried to throw them out. And then the response was, wait a second, I'm gay. I belong here. These are my people. Yes, I'm a skinhead, right? But I'm also gay. And you find, and I write extensively in one of my chapters about Brazil being, Brasil é país evangélico, mas é mais gay do que evangélico, which is a quote from Gilberto Diamondstein, in which he was looking specifically at São Paulo and looking at I focus in the second chapter about the Pride parades on the issue of the space around Avenida Paulista, the cartão postal, the financial center of Latin America, right? The banking district, the financial center, and the debate over the space issue in which the Pride Parade came into competition with the Marcha para Jesus, right? The March for Jesus, and the Marcha para Jesus, the evangelical march, was deslocado from the Avenida Paulista, whereas the Pride Parade was not. And so that led many people in the Marcha para Jesus, or evangelical movement in general, to say, wow, gay people have special privileges in Brazil, right? Because the righteous, using righteous because it's my own bias, the religious, proper, law-abiding citizen, is being displaced from the prominent center of Brazilian public life, and yet, the LGBT, they would not say that obviously, community is allowed to perform on those Sundays on Avenida Paulista. So your question touches also on a central theme in especially the work around the Pride parades in its second phase, in which there's not only a coexistence of evangelical identified Brazilians, but also ones who declare themselves to be LGBT and or T, and also evangelical, and are openly struggling with those two identities clashing, obviously, and the amount of stress and depression and tension that causes in their personal and professional lives. An example is the Igreja para Todos, right? Which was a huge part of the demonstration in 2013 of the Pride Parade, that was literally recruiting, whether there's an insidious agenda or not. I have not gone so far as to examine in depth, but to say that, yeah, you're welcome we're not going to change you, presumably. We're not going to convert you, the cura gay, you know, but that you can be yourself in your sexuality and in your religious convictions and beliefs at the same time. Whether this is utopian or not is another question. I would like to think that those kinds of intersectionalities are and embracing thereof promote acceptance and diversity on both sides of the political ideological spectrum of the religious right and the progressive left and in between. I'm not sure I can say that with conviction, but with Aquarian hope, I kind of see those moments, even though it's very depressing to see a skinhead who identifies as racist, but identifies as gay, and try to wrap my head around, you know, how that's possible. Of course, it's naive to think it's not possible. It happens all the time within gay community. There's a tremendous amount of racism, but to then acknowledge, you know, to some identities silence others within oneself is still an act of silencing or making invisible, but it's also an act of reconciling and reckoning with one's own multiplicities individually. And I believe that to be a first step until integration in a more open, tolerant way of saying that, well, if I'm a gay skinhead, how could I possibly be a skinhead because I'm supposed to hate Blacks, Jews, etc. And I think it's sort of the levels of the development of consciousness, of unimultiplicidade, the sort of utopian Tonze concept that would call for unimultiplicity literally, or everyone being themselves, being different in the same space. And that would be a way for us to heal, frankly, from the horrible circumstances and as Tracy noted, the very dark times in which we find ourselves now.
Well, we're already past 9:15, so I think I may actually not ask the last question and end on that. Hopeful note amidst the despair, maybe. I'm not quite sure how to put it, but perhaps better to actually end by noting how many congratulations and how many kind comments there are in the question and answer box that the audience can't see, but there are a lot, all well deserved. And unfortunately, we can't express in this format our appreciation by applause, so I'll do it for all of us by giving a big hand myself and saying how wonderful this was. Thanking the audience for coming. For those of us teaching at University of Miami, it's late in the semester, we're all tired. So the large audience is a testament to the importance of this book. And I'll end by thanking Steve for giving such a great presentation and by urging people to come to future book talks. We have a bunch of great ones next semester. So have a great evening, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much for being here at this difficult time.